usual reminder, make sure you have your PowerPoints and the worksheet printed out so that you're ready for this video, Chapter 6, Video 2. So we're in the midst of the Revolution. We'll take a quick minute and talk about some other things besides battles. We like to think back to this time and assume that everybody had bought into this idea of independence and were gung-ho, ready to be an independent country. But actually, historians have gone back and tried to measure it, and it looks like about a third of the colonists, well, I guess now independent, or working towards it, about a third wanted to stick with England. They were loyalists or Tories. About a third wanted to be independent, and about a third really was waiting to see who was going to win. And that's what side they were going to take. You had families divided. It's something that's talked more, emphasized more in the Civil War about brother fighting brother and so forth, but that was happening during the Revolution as well. Family members wanted to support loyalists, other family members wanted to be independent. You also had all kinds of people in each group, meaning you can't say one group was where all the wealthy people stood, and another group is where you find all the farmers. There was really no breakdown. You find wealthy people in each of these groups. You find merchants in each of these groups, farmers in each of these groups. So that didn't determine where people stood on this political issue. You also see a split with the American forces between the militia, which were very much the home guard, who were interested in protecting their home. Their main motivation was protecting their home and their land and their family. And they're going to be involved in some very brutal kind of fighting, versus the army, which is the more organized, the more trained, and they'll have the army, they'll have the battles. They're fighting for a number of reasons, perhaps for a paycheck, perhaps for land, perhaps for patriotism, a lot of different reasons there. If you've seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, Mel Gibson would fall into the category of the militia as opposed to being part of the regular American army there. The army also is going to have issues with smallpox, and Washington will do an experimental inoculation program to try to keep the incidence of smallpox in the American army down. So behind the scenes, where battles were being conducted nearby and so forth, life, of course, was very disrupted. And there was some concern among the American leadership about poor people having way too high expectations of a new government. Apparently they were getting some information about various people thinking that when the war was over, everybody was going to be wealthy and have huge farms and so forth, and there was some concern about that. John Adams is going to make this comment that the one thing that was absolutely going to be required of this new government was going to be a decency and a respect and a veneration for people of authority. He was trying to get across the point, there will be another government in place when this is over. It's not going to be a big free-for-all. All right, so back to the battles. We'll go to the Southern battles, which is, as a Southerner, I wish I could tell you better stories than what I'm about to tell you. November of 1778, the British take Savannah. They take it in roughly 2 hours. They keep Savannah until 1783, when the war is over, and so they go home. Charleston, General Cornwallis, and again, if you've seen The Patriot, this is Cornwallis from The Patriot. General Cornwallis attacks the city of Charleston in South Carolina there in 1780. The American leader was Ben Lincoln, and he'll end up having to surrender the city, and the soldiers will end up becoming prisoners of war. And the Battle of Charleston is going to be our biggest loss in the war, so the South has that claim to fame. There also was this battle at Camden, where Horatio Gates, remember, who had almost been the leader of American forces, Horatio Gates is going to be matched up against Cornwallis, and it is going to be a horrible, bitter, bloody, awful battle, at the end of which the Americans will flee for our lives. You can't even really call it a retreat. We fled for our lives. In a couple of instances, British soldiers chased us down, pinned us to trees with their bayonets, and cut off our heads. It was bad. And also, by some accounts, Horatio Gates rode his horse until it died somewhere in North Carolina. He was almost the head of all the American forces. Also, also in the South, we see a matchup between this guy whose nickname was, this British guy, Bloody Tarleton, and if you know how the British perceive the word bloody, this is not the best nickname I would think to have. But he's going to be matched up against some different guerrilla fighters. These guerrilla fighters include Francis Marion, whose nickname was the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, whose nickname was the Fighting Gamecock, which apparently is a really mean chicken, and Andrew Pickens, who apparently was not the kind of guy to get a nickname. They are going to be like the Mel Gibson character in The Patriot, in that they are sort of the home guard. They kind of appear out of nowhere and mess with the British and then disappear again. Nathaniel Greene, whose nickname was the Fighting Quaker because he was a Quaker who fought, Nathaniel Greene is a little bit of a bridge between the army and these guerrilla fighters because he sort of did both. And he will use his forces to do some hit-and-run tactics, which was a little bit like the guerrilla tactics. So he kind of did a little bit of both the army activities and the guerrilla activities. And he will ultimately defeat Bloody Tarleton at the Battle of Cowpens. This is Nathaniel Greene, not Tarleton. All right, and then Benedict Arnold. And the more I teach, the more I realize young people don't know who Benedict Arnold is. But when I was a kid, if somebody called you a Benedict Arnold, that was a really bad thing to be called. In 1780, he was the commander of the American fort at West Point. It was not a school at the time, it was a fort. And by historical accounts, he was extremely ambitious, and his morals showed a great deal of flexibility. He also was terribly in debt due to a gambling problem, and then he had a wife who kept saying, "Wouldn't you rather fight for the British? Wouldn't you rather fight for the British?" Well, we are going to find a plot, learn about a plot where Benedict Arnold is going to turn West Point over to the British. We're on our way to go get him when he is going to be tipped off, and he will flee and join the British as a general in their army. We will meet up against him. He will have linked up with Cornwallis here, and we will end up fighting against him and Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown, the last big battle of the war. Washington is headed in this general direction, Yorktown, Virginia, because there was a French fleet led by Admiral de Grasse coming up the Chesapeake with some reinforcements, some French reinforcements. So Washington is trying to get to Yorktown to get to these French reinforcements. Meanwhile, Cornwallis is trying to get there before Washington can get those reinforcements. And so they all kind of converge here. So what you have is you have the French Navy with Admiral de Grasse hurrying to try to get there. The British Navy is trying to stop them. You have then Washington and Cornwallis all trying to get to Yorktown as well. The French Navy will defeat the British Navy in the Chesapeake. Right? So that meant nobody was coming to help Cornwallis. And so Cornwallis is going to have to call for a truce. He had such little respect, though, for Washington and these people he just considered simple farmers, that he didn't even have the dignity to appear for this. All right, then we will proceed on to Chapter 7, Video 1.